Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on demand care for common ailments such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stlukesonline.org.
The Senate has eliminated public media funding, money that helped us reach rural Idaho with wildfire warnings and critical emergency alerts. Without it, voices may go silent in places that need us most. And it's not just Idaho. Our regional partnership through the Mountain West News Bureau is also at risk. We're the front line of trusted information in the West, and we're depending on you to keep it going. Donate now at boisestatepublicradio.org. There's no time to wait.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. More Idaho Matters right now. It's 1953 Hong Kong, and people staying at a mansion insist a horrible massacre took place. But police see nothing of the sort. In fact, they say it must have been a collective hallucination. So what really happened? Well, you'll need to read Kristen Loesch's new novel, The Hong Kong Widow, to find out. But first, we're lucky enough to have Kristen joining us today to talk more. Kristen, really nice to have you on the program.
Oh, thank you so much, Gemma. It's great to be here.
So I give just a little tidbit of the novel. Can you kind of give us a brief synopsis of your new book?
Yeah, so you did a great introduction. The book is set in 1950s Hong Kong and also 1930s Shanghai. It is a historical Gothic mystery, and it does focus on this one night when guests at a remote mansion witness a massacre and the police come and the police find no trace of it. But really, it's about one woman, one of these witnesses, returning to the scene of the crime years later to figure out what really happened. And it's also about her upbringing in Japanese-occupied Shanghai in the 1930s and how that ties into what happened that night in Hong Kong.
So you just said that the novel is what, a historical mystery?
Yes.
What did you say the genre is? Okay.
Historical Gothic mystery.
Okay, historical Gothic mystery. Explain to our listeners, if they're not familiar with that genre, what it is.
Sure, absolutely. One of my favorite topics. So obviously what makes it historical is the fact that it's set mostly in the past. There are three timelines. One is more of a modern day timeline set in 2015, but the main story takes place in 1950s Hong Kong and in 1930s Shanghai. And it is a mystery, so it centers around kind of one fundamental question that will be answered by the end of the story. But I call it a Gothic mystery because I love Gothic literature, traditional Gothic literature, and it has a lot of those wonderful Gothic elements to it, like a spooky house and family secrets and sort of, more of an atmospheric type of horror than what I would call real horror. So that's my personal definition of Gothic. But if people look online, there's a lot of talk and literature out there about Gothic fiction. I hope that helps.
Yeah, it does. Okay, so my understanding too is the book really is kind of a ghost story. So you've mentioned that it was really inspired by your own Chinese heritage. Can you talk a little bit about your heritage first off and kind of how you wove that into the story?
Absolutely. So I'm half Chinese on my mother's side, and this story was in large part inspired by my maternal grandfather's early childhood. So he was born and grew up in northern China. And he died about a decade ago, but we don't actually know how old he was really, because he had no birth certificate. And at some point he must have decided upon a birthday. So we definitely did celebrate those. But a lot of his early life was definitely shrouded in mystery. And there were many things that were too painful or perhaps that he just didn't want to look back upon, that he found difficult to talk about. But at times, that still being the case, there would be moments when that past would rise to the surface and he would be willing to say something, or he would be willing to share an anecdote. And those stories that he shared were so interesting, although interesting feels like an inadequate word. They were often horrifying. They were often quite sad. He
Hmm.
himself fled Shanghai after the Communist Revolution in 1949 and left for Taiwan and never saw any of his family again. So a lot of his life is what inspired certain aspects of the book.
And then you've lived in Hong Kong yourself. So how did that play into deciding to have some of the book set in Hong Kong, a big chunk of the book?
Yeah, that played a huge role because I only spent 1 year in Hong Kong, but I remember it so, so vividly. And I tried really hard in the book to bring the city to life, all its smells and its sights and sort of the lights and the heat. And it's just a really kind of powerful memory in my mind living there and so different from the rest of my life. Really, that's the only time I ever lived in Asia, and I knew that I was going to have to set a novel there at some point. And in Hong Kong there's a really thriving and fascinating ghost culture, and I heard so many creepy urban legends while I was living there, and everyone talked about them and they were just all over the place. Everyone seemed to know them. And I really looked to that, I think, as a source of inspiration when I was drafting the novel.
Mm. What was it like for you to live in Asia? I mean, having the background, the heritage that you have, yet, only spending a year living in Asia. What was that like for you?
It was interesting. There were times when there was a bit of obviously culture shock for me. I grew up in San Francisco and Seattle. I do speak Mandarin, but Mandarin is not the language that most native Hong Kongers speak, which is Cantonese. So there was a bit of a language gap. I was working in finance at that time for a large chunk of that time, and so I was surrounded by a lot of expats. And I felt that I definitely wanted to make an effort to get to know the city outside of that sort of finance expat circle that I was in. And that's a decision that I'm really glad I made, learning some Cantonese, seeing more of the city beyond sort of central Hong Kong, Hong Kong Island. But definitely, there were difficulties. I was very young and I had a lot to learn.
So I want to go back to your grandfather for a moment.
Sure.
Because as you mentioned, his history and really not knowing some of it, right? The beginnings of that history. But then, as you said, at times, I'm sure it was so painful he didn't want to talk about it. But then you would learn some things, right, about this family folklore, about the history. How important was it for you to make sure that you incorporated some of this into a book? Because, and I'm asking this because I'm thinking to myself, gosh, he didn't even have a birth certificate, right? Not even a piece of paper to say when he was born. And now you have this novel that in some ways brings his life to paper, right? I mean, we can pick it up and we can learn things anecdotally, maybe about your grandfather.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to say that the novel is about him. I would say that I drew
Right.
from his life as inspiration and I really wanted to honor him in a way, I suppose. I was very close with both my grandparents. My grandmother died more recently during the pandemic. And I really felt that this novel was a way to be closer to them when there were no other ways left. I
Mm,
think I regret that in a way that I wasn't able to have more of these conversations with them, either because I was uncomfortable asking or because I felt like a certain degree of secrecy or mystery had been established and we shouldn't somehow fiddle with that too much. I'm not sure, but there was definitely, while they were alive, I had the sense that I had to hold back. And that was one of my regrets, or is one of my regrets, I should say. And this novel was a way of grappling with that, I think. And I really wanted to look to his life and think, okay, what aspects of it do I not necessarily want to write about specifically, but more broadly in terms of, what was going on in that time, what must have been,
Hmm.
must have it have been like to grow up like that, and to, be separated from your family like that, to have your whole world turned upside down like that. And so these much bigger questions. And as I investigated and read memoirs from people who had lived through the same things and had found a way to talk about those things in a way that my grandparents hadn't, that was a way for me to feel closer to them now, and that was deeply important to me.
Hmm. Well, and I was just going to say that, right? Is that unfortunately your grandfather's story isn't unique. So I think,
Yeah.
you incorporating those stories into this novel, I mean, it's important because there are probably a lot of people who aren't aware of stories like your grandfather.
Yeah, I would go so far as to say that probably the Pacific War, the Pacific Theater overall is perhaps less known to people, less familiar. So
Hmm.
that was another reason that I wanted to write the book. I felt that there are still angles, still so many stories left to be told. And I also felt that often when you meet members of an older generation and you have no idea what they've lived through, it can be really eye-opening to get even the slightest bit of some of their stories and realize, wow, there's this whole other life that they had. There's this whole other existence that I can't even imagine. And I know that I got that feeling while I was reading one of Amy Tan's novels. I think it's, well, The Joy Luck Club, obviously, but
Uh-huh.
The Kitchen God's Wife, I think it's called. And I think in that story, there's a character that, it seems, oh, just any other person, but actually everyone has this incredible story to tell, this fascinating and harrowing past that they just haven't shared. And I find that so interesting and often so tragic,
Hmm.
but so important as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to get back to the book for a minute, and I want to talk specifically about the mansion where,
Oh, okay.
maybe a massacre happened, maybe it was a hallucination. You got to read the book to find out. But you kind of base this mansion on two mansions in Hong Kong. You actually visited them. And you said this kind of inspired the novel's mansion. Now, these two mansions in Hong Kong, um, are haunted, like legit haunted. So talk to us about that and and how it really played into this mansion in the book. Look, I'm all good with hauntings as long as they all mind their manners if I'm around. That's all I have to say.
Excellent. I am not going to go on record to say that these houses are haunted,
Okay.
nor did I actually go into the houses. I have to specify, I have to make clear. But I was particularly intrigued by two houses among many, many different places in Hong Kong that are absolutely fascinating from a variety of perspectives, whether that's historical or architecturally or just so many reasons. But there were two houses that always stood out to me. And one of them is in Yuan Long, which is in the New Territories, kind of closer to China and away from Hong Kong Island. So most people who visit Hong Kong will never go anywhere near Yuan Long, most likely. But there is a house there, sort of in the middle of apartment buildings, or very kind of odd location, I suppose you could say, for
Mm-hmm.
a haunted mansion. But I lived fairly close to that house kind of towards the end of my time in Hong Kong with my then boyfriend. It's much cheaper to live out there, obviously. And I heard about this house, and I knew that I had to see it at least. I don't know if you're actually allowed to go in. I'm assuming you're not. I'm assuming that would be trespassing, and I didn't go in, but I did go up to it, and there is a gate, that kind of really spooky looking gate. And then around the gate are just parked cars and delivery vans and kind of the rush of traffic. So you think, oh, it's nothing special. And then you kind of go around and you see this empty courtyard with a beautiful fountain in the middle, very old and run down, obviously, but still beautiful. And beyond the fountain, in the middle of these regular looking buildings, is this gorgeous, incredibly decayed house. And the
Oh,
stories that people tell about this house are also very interesting. The locals are absolutely convinced it is haunted, at least the ones that I spoke to. And there's very bloody and horrifying urban
oh,
legends to go with that house. And I think because I lived so close to it, I found that so interesting. And then the other house, which I suppose you could say is a more direct source of inspiration for the house in the book, because in the book, the mansion is located on Victoria Peak, which is the enormous mountain on Hong Kong Island.
hmm,
If anyone is ever in Hong Kong and they're looking towards central Hong Kong, they will just see this mountain looming over everything. And it's usually quite misty. And that mist and that fog is why it's so green. It's very much jungle. And I placed the house in my novel there. And there is a real life house on this mountain that is so called the most haunted mansion in Hong Kong, but please take that with a grain of salt. That's probably also hyped up for tourists and ghost seekers and everyone who has any interest in such things. But the most interesting thing about this house, which is abandoned and has a really fascinating history, it's called Dragon Lodge, I believe, and it's on
uh-huh.
Victoria Peak. If you Google it or look it up, you'll find so much about it. The most interesting thing to me about this house is that it is kind of right off the walking path. So there's a path going up the peak, which I went up many times. And this house is sort of right off that path. And it's this spooky, eerie, decayed
Oh.
house with this greenhouse, and you can sort of see it through the trees. And really, it's the atmosphere of it, the vibe of it that is so wonderfully spooky. And I loved that so much. But I personally did not have the guts to hop the fence and have a look, but I'm sure others have and others will.
Well, I would be right there with you. I do not need to go into it for sure. With that said, before we wrap up, what do you hope folks take away from this book? I mean, because there's just so much to it.
Oh, that's a lovely question. I think to me, most of all, this book is about the mother and daughter relationship. I think that's one of the main themes that I really wanted to explore. And I did that partly as an homage to the Joy Luck Club and other books that really influenced me when I was young, being half Chinese and for a long period of my life, not really knowing much about my parents, my mother's background and my grandparents' background, and desperately wanting to know more. And the idea that that older generations, that past generations have these incredible lives that we don't think about on a day-to-day basis, that if you just open it up a little, you find this whole fascinating history, this just incredible story. And I hope that in reading the book, people get a sense of that and that they're immersed in this whole other world. And that's my hope for the book.
Well, I want to thank you so much for taking time with us today. We've been speaking with award-winning author Kristen Loesch about her newest novel, The Hong Kong Widow, which comes out this fall. You've been listening to Idaho Matters from Boise State Public Radio. I'm Gemma Gaudette.
These days, there's so much news, it can be hard to keep up with what it all means for you, your family, and your community. The Consider This podcast from NPR features our award-winning journalism. 6 days a week, we bring you a deep dive on a news story and provide the context and analysis that helps you make sense of the news. We get behind the headlines. We get to the truth. Listen to the Consider This podcast from NPR.